Yes, 1964. I had heard a great deal about the Aspen Center for Physics because Mike Cohen had been one of our graduate students at Caltech and George Stranahan one of our undergraduates. And I hadn't I hadn't decided to come at all to the Physics Center, but which at that time was the physics division of the Aspen Institute. But I did come to Aspen for a top secret arms control and disarmament agency study held at the Four Seasons, now the music school. And naturally, I found my way over here to what is now the Physics Center, and I was enchanted by the whole operation. I thought it was marvelous, and my wife and daughter thought it was marvelous too. My son probably as well, but he was just turning 1. He spent his first birthday here, so he didn't have much to say about it. The center was so small at that time that everybody went on the weekend hike together, all the members with their families. We went to West Maroon once, and the glacier lilies were just out. It was so beautiful. The parties were held at campgrounds. Later, we couldn't do that anymore, but we would reserve a difficult campground or some other one, and have a marvelous fling out there in the wilds. The jeep roads went further at that time. Later, they were cut back in a move that most of us approve of. But that way, we could be even deeper into the countryside when we met. Everything was on a very small scale and very informal. I remember Mike Cohen complaining that newly arrived visitors would come to him with their troubles, and he would ask them, "When you're at the Institute for Advanced Study, do you go to Oppenheimer to complain that your toilet doesn't work properly?" I told that story to Carl Kazin, who succeeded Oppenheimer as director. He didn't find it funny at all. Apparently it happened to him every day. Our status as part of the Aspen Institute had many virtues, but also some drawbacks. The Institute and many people in town who associate with the Institute, and many people from distant places who associate with the Institute, have been taught to worship Herbert Bayer and Mortimer Adler. I think most people at the Physics Center are not so keen on either one of them. But in particular, Herbert Bayer, who designed these cinder block buildings, and apparently told Peter Kaus once, when they were both circling over Aspen, landing in an airplane and sitting next to each other, he said, "Look down. Do you see the Big Dipper? That's what architecture is all about." Apparently he thought the buildings were in the shape of the Big Dipper. I mean, the layout of the buildings was in the shape of the Big Dipper. But as I understand it, we had a leak in the roof right over the front door of what is now Stranahan Hall, at that time the only building. And naturally, every summer we would fix the leak so that our carpets wouldn't get ruined and people wouldn't have water pouring down on their heads as they entered the building. But Bayer, who at that time was still in good enough health to come to Aspen in the summer, would come over to inspect his creation and insist on behalf of the landlord, the Aspen Institute, that we unfix the front door ceiling and restore the leak. Another aspect, of course, was that with the Aspen Institute as our landlord, we didn't really control our territory here. And that was the subject of discussions that lasted for many decades. I don't remember the dates of the individual incidents very well, but the arguments about the land and the buildings went on for a very long time. As long as we were part of the Aspen Institute, it was relatively simple. It had drawbacks, as I just explained, but it was simple. But after we were spun off in 1968, along with, if I remember correctly, along with the Music Associates, also spun off. Then we had a very peculiar relationship because we were not part of the Institute, but the Institute owned the land and the buildings. It was the landlord, and there were all sorts of possible sources of friction. And so we negotiated. It seemed endless. Went on, as I say, for decades. And the fate of this part of town was at stake because we were just part of a much bigger problem. What would happen to Institute land, Institute buildings, and so on? And what would happen to the music facilities? What would happen to our facilities? Well, in the middle of that, I took over as chairman from George Stranahan, who I think had been both chairman and president. I didn't know much about being chairman of a board, but after a few months, I had the example of Warren Burger, the Chief Justice of the U.S., to work with. I became the first citizen regent of the Smithsonian from west of the Appalachians in about 1974. And there are congressional regents from the House and the Senate. There's the Chief Justice of the U.S. and the Vice President of the U.S. And then a few citizen regents. Until then, they couldn't believe that someone from the West, California in my case, would actually come to the meetings. And in the middle of the 19th century, I can understand that was probably a reasonable concern. By 1974, they overcame that objection, and I was appointed a regent. I was on something called the Council of the Smithsonian, which was a set of advisors to the secretary. Secretary is the head of the Smithsonian. Sort of a kitchen cabinet. And that was a lot of fun. Wonderful, interesting people. Many of them academics, but not absolutely all. And very interesting discussions. But then they made me a regent, and I remained on the council, and the idea was I would be a sort of liaison between the two organizations. But that didn't work out. I just couldn't make that many trips to Washington. I got to the trustees, to the regents' meetings, but I couldn't make it also to the council meetings. It's too bad, but time is finite. Now, the Vice President of the U.S. is automatically a member, and the Chief Justice as well. And traditionally, the Chief Justice is the Chancellor. In other words, the chairman of the board. And the Vice President of the U.S. is the Vice Chancellor. And that was the case at that time. So my classmate, George H.W. Bush, was the Vice Chancellor, and Warren Burger was the Chancellor. And despite our somewhat different political views, Warren Burger and I got along very well. And occasionally he would send me off to wherever I was going in his car with his driver and so on. People I visited were quite impressed that I arrived in the Chief Justice's car. We also shared a love of wine. And antique furniture, although his tastes ran to early American furniture, which never particularly interested me. So I learned how to be a chair by watching Warren Burger. And everything got done with great expedition. He would announce some result of the discussion and say, Immediately afterwards, without objection, so ordered. That was the end of it. Occasionally somebody would rush in with an item for discussion, but usually there wasn't time. So I found that was a very effective method here too. Anyway, there wasn't much of importance to discuss. The main thing that we did as officers of the center was to argue with the Institute people. This included a time when Bob Anderson, who had given a lot to the Aspen Institute and was the head of it, chairman of the board and so on, when Bob Anderson was in a fight with the city because he wanted to turn the Institute land and the meadows and so on over to some private agency to manage, and to build a large number of additional units and so on, make the whole thing economically self-sufficient and all that. And the townspeople were quite unhappy about it, and the other cultural organizations, the Music Associates and the Physics Center, were not too happy either. So we had endless arguments. At one time, there was a Palestinian developer, Mr. Hadid, who was somehow in charge of the land and the buildings for a while. And so we had to meet with him and his lawyer, and it went on and on and on. Then somehow control shifted back to the Institute, and we were once more negotiating with the Institute. Bob Anderson was a member of our board, too, if I remember correctly, and would occasionally make motions that were passed favorable to the Physics Center. But of course, they weren't motions at the motions at the board meeting of the Institute, only the Physics Center, so they didn't have any real effect. But that went on and on and on. It's all a big blur in my mind. I don't remember the details at all. But I do have the feeling that the curious course of 7th Street, it comes down and then jogs to the left and then goes almost to 8th Street and then turns again to the right. I think that was my suggestion. Part of our effort to preserve the ring. And indeed, we have preserved the integrity of the ring, finally. And it took years and years and years of fighting. But indeed, it's not developed. There are some houses along the edge of it, one of which touches the Physics Center, somewhat disturbing what Peter Kaus called our circle of serenity, but not very much. The presence of that house right on the boundary is really the only intrusive feature of the present situation. And I suppose the people there know that we will get very angry if they become noisy. And I'm sure they're afraid of reprisals. Having visited, but not officially visited the center in 1964, our family came back in 66 or 67. 66, I think it was. It might have been 67. Anyway, we returned and have come every year. I have come every year since then, sometimes for only a few days, sometimes for the whole summer. But I don't think I've missed a year since then. Our whole family was delighted with the area, with the people, the Physics Center, with all the arrangements here. The hikes, the picnics, all the social events. The attitude toward children, which was very permissive, but not too permissive. They weren't allowed to do they weren't allowed to inflict damage, but they were allowed to run around and make noise and so on, which they loved to do. It was all very nice. The work at the Physics Center, of course, some of it has been very, very important. Last summer, we celebrated the 20th anniversary of the breakthroughs in string theory that occurred mainly at Caltech to begin with, and then here in the summer, here at the Physics Center in the summer. That was very important. And over the years, there were many other things of great importance that were done here. The National Science Foundation can be quite pleased, I think, with a very modest investment over the years, mostly in rental supplements for members, for visitors. It's probably one of the most cost-effective things the National Science Foundation has ever done. And I believe it's still continuing to this day. The system is a very good one of people installed to an office, plenty of opportunity for mingling over coffee, mingling at the belly wash machine, and the going to get paper and pencils and so on and so on. There are all sorts of occasions for people to meet and talk. And the outdoor seminars, which were delightful, and now are indoors, but still quite delightful. Do we still have outdoor seminars? I remember those very, very well. The whole atmosphere was excellent and very conducive to useful work. People formed associations. Some of it is formalized in that people coordinate their applications and say they will work together or form an official program. People who attend seminars together and work together. But often it's unofficial and impromptu. Either way, it seems to work extremely well. It's been pretty straightforward, actually. The negotiations with the Institute over decades over our land and buildings, which we finally received, were the main serious complication. Everything else was just a matter of making sensible decisions about how to organize our life together. And physicists can be pretty good at that. And I think the particular physicists who had responsibility in the early days, some of whom are here, like Randy and Paul Fishbane, and the founders, George and Mike, all had some relatively sensible ideas of how to organize things. So we didn't go off in crazy directions. That would have been the only danger. As it is, I think most of the decisions were fairly routine.
Let me ask one question. How did you come by the most photographed house in Aspen?
Oh, the most photographed. It's also in the Aspen coloring book.
Well, start out by saying what it is. Yeah.
I said the house is also in the Aspen coloring book. It's also a favorite house for painters and people and photographers, painters as well as photographers. And just yesterday, I saw it in the Aspen newspaper, one of the Aspen newspapers, in a real estate ad for a real estate company that has absolutely nothing to do with the house. But they put a picture of the house in their ad because the house is so nice looking. It sort of epitomizes Aspen. This is a house that was built in 1893, the last year when anybody built houses in Aspen until recent times. Because that's when when silver crashed, when governments, starting with British India and soon followed by the U.S., stopped free coinage of silver. Free coinage meant that if you had silver, you could bring it to the government, and for a few percent charge, they would turn it into coins. And the rate was a very favorable one. So silver mining was a very lucrative occupation. All of a sudden, during 1893, it became a much less lucrative occupation, and the silver mining towns more or less closed down. So that was the end of the building of houses in that era. 3 houses on that corner were built in 1893. Anyway, I had thought of having a house in Aspen, even though at that time the Physics Center provided housing in the West End, quite reasonable rates, especially because of the National Science Foundation subsidy. but also reasonable in any case. So one could live in a wonderful Victorian house in the west end of Aspen, courtesy of the Physics Center. One didn't need to buy, really. Nevertheless, I was so taken with Aspen that I thought it would be very nice to buy. My wife Margaret and I thought about various possibilities. One was to buy a lot right across from the music parking lot and move a house onto that lot. And we found a house that was for sale that could be moved. But it wasn't a very good-looking one. It was an old house, all right, from the Victorian period, but it was not very impressive. And when we made a special trip for real estate purposes, we weren't very pleased with that idea, and we gave it up. So then we just looked around for a normal sale, normal real estate deal. And Carol Ann Jacobson, who ran a local real estate agency and had been a secretary at the Physics Center in the very early days, was our agent. She looked around for places for us. And she showed us 3 or 4 houses in the West End. One was a recently built A-frame, which didn't appeal to us very much, and there were a couple of others. And then there was the Victorian, which was entirely pink inside and out. The outside was pink, the inner walls were pink, the furniture was painted pink, everything was pink. Apparently the owner, Buzz Robinson, who was the head of some Fish and Game Commission or something in Denver, Buzz Robinson had hired some teenagers and given them pink paint. And I think maybe somebody donated some pink paint, in fact. In any case, the pink paint was sloshed onto all the walls, all the furniture. And I thought the house was very good possibility. And but Margaret seemed uncertain, and Carol Ann was somewhat negative. And I couldn't understand why. And I asked them. Finally, I got it out of them. They couldn't stand the thought of a pink house. I asked, couldn't we change it? I mean, couldn't we put a layer of some other kind of paint over it? And they said, we thought you'd never spring for it. Anyway, we didn't want to put up all the money. By today's standards, it wasn't very expensive. But we looked for a partner. We thought we'd share the house with some other family. And we looked around, and we tried a chemistry professor at Caltech, a very well-known one, Jack Roberts, and his wife Edith. And they said, well, we'd love to. This is a really nice thing. We love Aspen. We love to go skiing in Aspen, and this house looks marvelous. But we have a boat, and a boat is a hole in the water into which you pour money. And so we haven't got the resources to join with you in this effort. And so we gave up for a while and didn't make a bid on the house. But then Mrs. Pepke visited Caltech. And that was a very special day. And they tried to invite to the lunch all the women who had some connection with Aspen, including Margaret, my wife. Sitting next to her at lunch was Shirley Gray, the wife of a young chemistry professor, Harry Gray, very brilliant chemistry professor, who wrote textbooks on chemistry. Very mysterious in some ways to a physicist because they do quantum mechanics without quantum mechanics. But anyway, he wrote these textbooks, which were very popular and used many places. And he wrote them as part of the Aspen Chemistry Writing Project. And the publisher, they leased the house for that purpose. And they came to Aspen every summer and stayed in that house, and Harry worked on writing his chemistry textbooks. So Shirley was telling Margaret about that, and Margaret said, well, you know, we we're thinking of buying a house in Aspen, and we were looking for a partner. Are you interested at all? And Shirley said, well, no. It isn't Aspen so much that attracts us as that house where we've stayed. And I have a picture of it here. She brought out the picture, and of course it was the same house. So we made a deal to share the house 50-50, and each put in half the money. I didn't think of it as an investment because prices had gone up so much, factor of 5, 10, something like that, by that time. This was 1970. During the previous decade or 15 years, prices had gone up by such a large factor that I knew that was the top of the market, that there would never again be serious increases in price here. And therefore I didn't think of it as an investment, but rather as just something to do because we loved the house and we loved Aspen and we liked to be here in the summer and perhaps in the winter to ski and so on. So we went ahead with the deal. And indeed, we were willing to put up the money to paint the house another color. I worked on the color scheme with Roger Moyer, who is still doing painting in Aspen after all these years. He was very young then. And we got the scheme mostly blue with white and chocolate trim. And it's been like that ever since. And I forget what we did about the walls inside were painted over with more natural wall colors. And the wooden furniture was repainted, except we left one room pink. That had been a bathroom in Victorian times. And by the way, we met the three old ladies who had been young girls and women at the time that they lived in the house first. It was the Gould family. They were 87, 88, and 89, I think, something like that at the time. But we met all three of them. And they had 3 bedrooms upstairs. One of those bedrooms was later turned into a bathroom, and that's the one we left pink. The head of the family, Mr. Gould, was a partner in Gould and Grover, the Mesa store at the corner of 4th and Main, which during the time we're talking about was a bakery. It had been a general store in the time of Mr. Gould and Mr. Grover. Mr. Gould was also the manager of the Midnight Mine, superintendent of the Midnight Mine. So he was a rather important local character. And apparently a bit odd. He had a dream that the cottonwoods along between the house and the ditch fell over in a storm and destroyed the house. That was not really possible because the wind blows from the other side. But in the dream, of course, the wind could be reversed. It was. And as soon as he had that dream, he chopped down all the cottonwoods. I had to plant aspen to replace them. So the Grays turned out to be silent partners. They didn't come anymore, and they didn't have much to do with the running of the house. And eventually, I became a 70-30 owner of the house, 70% to 30%. And I was going to buy Harry out of the remaining 30%, but somehow the negotiations kept failing. And so it remained 70-30, but he was a silent partner, and I really ran the place. So I had to make decisions about planting the aspen and so forth. I planted a lot of aspen on the lawn also, and they're still there. They're thriving. The aspen on the side are not doing so well because the woman who lived in the little house, in the carriage house, who rented the carriage house from me and sort of took care of the property in our absence, Janet Shelton, had unfortunately used a weed eater on the lawn, and brought the weed eater too close to the aspen, ringing them practically. So there was very little cambium left. There was very little pathway left for nutriments to go up into the trees. As a result, most of them look very sickly today, the ones I planted along the side to replace the cottonwoods chopped down by Mr. Gould.